The Special Investigating Unit, the SIU, has demanded that German software giant SAP pays back R1 billion in fees to Eskom on state capture deals. That news was broken by the amaBhungange Investigating Unit today. SAP scored several deals with Eskom, and they seem to be gained through business development fees that were paid to companies owned or controlled by the Guptas. Evidence has emerged over the years suggesting these fees were actually bribes paid to secure the work. The company initially acted as if South African executives were to blame for dodgy dealing, but the evidence suggests that global SAP leaders were aware of the potential for bribery. In 2018, emails and documents obtained by the SABC suggested that the SAP compliance team signed off on deals despite having been warned about the Gupta family acting in the background. SAP has already agreed to pay back money to the Department of Water over a tainted deal. Well, to discuss, we're joined by investigative journalist at the amaBhungange Centre for Investigative Journalism, Susan Comrie. Susan, thank you for being with us. In short, what was SAP doing to secure tenders with Eskom and other state companies?
Well, it's a fascinating process that they had, a fascinating business model. As you said, they had this method of hiring these business development partners. Now, supposedly these would be people or companies that would go in and identify business opportunities for SAP and then help them to conclude the deal. Now, where things went south, where there's an element of alleged corruption in these cases, is that you have these small companies, in this case, a company called potentially for the Guptas, going in. SAP had established business with Eskom, with other SOEs. They weren't really doing any work that anyone could see, but yet they were walking away with an absolutely massive chunk of the deals that SAP would sign with these SOEs.
All right, so it seemed dodgy. They were taking some of the money, and that was the concern about kickbacks. Money has already been paid back by SAP in relation to water deals, so it's the same issue playing out again.
Absolutely, and that's the most fascinating part. We tend to sort of view these kind of multinationals that are caught up in state capture allegations as perhaps just being tripped up by the Guptas. In SAP's case, what's so interesting is that they used the same business model, the same business development partner model, in order to secure massive contracts with other government entities. The water deal, as you've mentioned, they've already agreed to pay back, I think it's 345 million rand on that deal. That also involved business development partners, but in that instance, it wasn't, as far as we know, a Gupta-linked entity. So this really does seem to be more of an SAP problem than necessarily a Gupta or state cap problem. That's really what these court cases are bringing to light.
Is there only speculation, or is there any evidence that money paid to these smaller companies that took a big chunk of the fees, essentially for SAP to get the work, that this was passed on to politicians or SOE leaders or the like?
There's certainly some speculation in the court papers that the SIU has filed. I mean, they do a very good job of laying out with these kind of flow diagrams of where the money went. So, for instance, what we know is that once the money was paid into these kind of Gupta front companies, it very quickly filtered through into the rest of the Gupta empire. One of the things, for instance, that we learned today after reading the court papers is that part of the money that SAP paid to these Gupta front companies was then used by the Guptas to help fund the purchase of Mkonki, the auditing firm, which then again was used as a sort of battering ram to get into these other massive contracts at Eskom. With regard to whether that money flowed on to politicians or whether it flowed on to kind of leaders within Eskom, the SIU sort of dangles some tantalizing details. For instance, they go back to the Zondo Commission, what's been said about Anoj Singh and his kind of various visits to the Gupta's compound at Saxonwold, how he would supposedly be driven to Knox Vaults after that, where he had these kind of larger and larger safety deposit boxes. There's quite strong evidence that's been presented by witnesses at the Zondo Commission to suggest that may have been linked to these processes. So the SIU brings that up, but does rely on other aspects. They don't need to prove, for instance, that a kickback was paid in order to reclaim the money. They can rely on sort of lower level things to say, look, this didn't comply with the PFMA, return the money.
And we know corruption, bribery is so hard to prove because people don't put these kind of deals in black and white usually. What does this finding by the SIU mean for SAP? Because the company, as far as I know, hasn't been found guilty in a court of law of bribery or corruption. So what does this mean?
So it's a fascinating one. I mean, the SIU is filing these papers with the special tribunal, which means that they are just going after the money. They're not, sort of charging them with corruption or anything like that. That can happen at a later stage. What's going to be fascinating to see is whether in the face of this, SAP agrees to simply say, we'll pay back the money, or if they're actually going to, take that sort of further step of responding to the allegations. One can see, for instance, that the SIU did interview a large number of people when putting together their affidavit. But it's quite clear that, SAP is still withholding a lot of information. They are essentially challenging SAP to say, if you've got the evidence that shows that this was not bribery, because it sure, quacks like a duck, then come forward and put that information into court. I suspect, however, what we've seen in the past with SAP is when cases have been brought to the special tribunal, for instance, with the water deal case, they have simply used that as an opportunity to settle and leave it there without actually putting their version into the public domain. They've been incredibly reluctant to do that, both through the courts, but also through responding to media. They've kind of, I think, taken the approach that they might have far bigger problems in other jurisdictions, for instance, in the US, where they operate, and they could be subject to incredibly strict anti-corruption laws there. So I think that perhaps might explain why they've been so reluctant to put a version into the public domain.
Yeah, and we've seen that sort of response from other companies implicated as well. Very quickly, years ago, SAP basically admitted something was wrong. It changed its modus operandi in developing countries, but then it emerged that it wasn't only a problem in South Africa. Global players weren't in the dark. So tell us what you think SAP knew.
Well, it's a fascinating question. As you say, as you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the papers which the SABC had helped to bring to light in 2018 really started to give us a picture of what SAP at a higher level, at a global level, what they may have known. Now, the system that they had used, the business development partner system, that wasn't a South African only method that they used. That was something they were using globally. That was a process that they acknowledged in memos carried a high risk of corruption. So, the question becomes, these deals were not just big enough to kind of raise alerts at a South African level. These deals needed to be signed off at a global level. What you see is these transactions, the final signatures on these deals are being added by people at a global level. We also know from the papers that, red flags were raised in South Africa and were sent up the chain to SAP at a global level. So really, this is kind of a case that starts to sort of unravel not just what the local executives at SAP knew, but what SAP knew globally and the kinds of practices that they've been engaging in all over the world.
All right, thank you so much for that. Susan Comrie, investigative journalist at amaBhungange Centre for Investigative Journalism.